You're listening to the Wanderlusting Wives podcast, your podcast for escaping life's monotony, indulging in your wildest travel fantasies, and discovering the constant beauty of this ever-changing world.
On this week's episode, we're joined by special guest Kat Medina, who shares about her experiences in Cuba.
Welcome to the Wanderlusting Wives podcast. We are your navigators, Allison
and Regan. Welcome to another episode of the Wanderlusting Wives podcast. We are super duper excited for our guest today. She has written an amazing book. I have not had the chance to read it yet, but it was in my mailbox today. Allie's had a chance to read it, and we're just really excited to talk to her. But before we get into introducing our guest, Allie, go ahead and plug away at our social media.
Yeah, I'll keep it short and sweet because the guest is the most exciting part here. So if you are not already, be sure to check us out on social media. You can find us on Instagram at WanderlustingWives, Twitter or X, whatever it's called these days. That is at WanderlustWives, and then Facebook, Wanderlusting Wives Podcast. And if you're interested in being a guest on our podcast, we'd love to hear from you. You can send us a DM or email us. And our email is wanderlustingwives@gmail.com. So without further ado, the fun part of the episode, we have Kat Medina joining us today. She is the author of the book, The Joys of Jet Lag, and we are so excited to hear about your book as well as your experiences in Cuba. So welcome, Kat.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me on.
Yeah, we are so excited to have you here. So as always, we want to give our guests some time to maybe share about their social media or any books that they have written. So now is your time to shine. What is your book about? What's the title? Where can we find it?
So the book is called The Joys of Jet Lag, How to Use a Traveler's Mindset to Not Be an A-Hole in Daily Life. And it's basically a guidebook for how you can use a traveler's mindset to experience more joy in daily life. I mean, most of us, if we're in the United States, only get a couple of weeks of vacation a year. But we all know that feeling. You know, we get to our destination and the stress and worries just kind of melt away. We're quicker to laugh, more spontaneous, and we're able to view the setbacks as part of the adventure. So this book teaches people how to seek out moments of awe and fulfillment, regardless of whether they're standing in line at a Trader Joe's or sipping margs on a sandy beach in Mexico. And it kind of came about because for most of my life, I was two different people. I've traveled to 35 countries and lived in Ecuador, France, Spain, and Argentina. And when I traveled, I was my best self and joy was effortless. But then when I returned home, it felt elusive or forced even. And I try to control the uncontrollable. I'd get frustrated if things didn't go as planned. And I stopped appreciating little things like clean drinking water or a hot shower, even though I knew firsthand just how rare those things were in so many parts of the world and places that I'd been. So I focused on the next trip when I could feel fully alive again and just kind of work and go through the motions. And one day I realized that as much as I prioritize traveling, I still spend most of my time at home. And it felt like such a waste to spend my days wishing I was somewhere else instead of enjoying where I was. So a couple of years ago, I made it my mission to bridge the gap between who I was when I traveled and who I was at home. And I realized that it all came down to mindset, or a traveler's mindset. And by embodying this mindset in daily life, I was able to tap into the joy that I craved, no matter where I was. And then I decided to write a book about it in hopes of providing people with simple but impactful strategies that they could use in their life to experience more joy and adventure on the day-to-day instead of just when they're on vacation. And social, I'm most active on Instagram, Kat Medina Writer, and it's Kat with a K.
Awesome. Yeah, I like Regan said, she hasn't got the chance to read it, but I read it and it was like totally speaking to me because I feel like the same. I try new foods, I'm more adventurous, I'm more outgoing when I'm traveling. And yeah, your book really spoke to me. And I really liked how at the end of each chapter you had like the different, like maybe 1 through 5, or depending on how long the chapter was, you had like a nice little bow wrapping up each chapter of the tips and steps you could follow in that particular section. But where can we find your book so everyone else can enjoy the joys of jet lag as well?
Pretty much anywhere you can buy books, Amazon, Barnes and Noble. Bookshop.org is a really cool website that directs you to independent bookstores. So I always recommend that, or just going to your local indie shop. And if they don't have it, you can just ask them to order it.
Awesome. Yeah, that's a great tip. Thank you for that.
Awesome. Yeah, it's interesting too. Like my husband actually said something that's really kind of coming back to me now that you're talking about your book and everything, like talking about how travel really is magic. Like I think it's just the most magical thing you can do in your life, and how it brings out a new you sometimes. And we talk about it how it's like, oh, it's vacation Regan or whatever it is. But we were driving through North Carolina recently and my husband said, if this was in Europe, we would be like, oh my God, this is the most amazing thing I've ever seen. You know, and it's like, but it's in our backyard and it feels like the day to day because we just had to drive through North Carolina, that it's like not somehow not as special or something. So I'm really excited to read your book and to get to some practical tips for like how we can bring the magic of travel into day to day life. But before we get into the destination part of this, I want to know, how did you get into traveling in the first place? Why was traveling as a whole important to you?
So I went on my first trip, like solo trip, when I was 17 as a part of a study abroad program to France. But prior to that, I just was always drawn to traveling. And just as a kid, I wanted to be like a MacGyver explorer when I grew up, and just see as much of the world as I could. So I always had that sense of adventure that had me craving new places, meeting new people, trying new things, seeing awe-inspiring nature. But after I went on my first solo trip, it was for 6 months, and I didn't know a word of French before I left, besides like singing songs and counting to 10. So it was a massive culture shock. And even though it was incredibly difficult going to a place where I didn't know a soul and couldn't really speak the language, by the end of it, I had made several friends, many of whom I still stay in contact with. And it just kind of, it didn't necessarily light something up in me, but it reaffirmed what I already knew. And it's that this is the key for me feeling the most alive, being out so outside of my comfort zone that all you can do is just accept whatever is in front of you and kind of go along with whatever is happening instead of trying to resist it.
Yeah, I love that perspective. That's really cool that you had that study abroad experience. I feel like so many people don't get that opportunity until they go off to college, and a lot of them are there to just party, and that's fine too, but it sounds like you got a lot more out of that experience, and then it was just kind of like a snowball effect into, the rest of your life, the point that you've written a book about your traveling, and then the topic today of Cuba. That is so different from France, at least my knowledge of Cuba, right? So let's jump right into Cuba. Why Cuba? How did you get there as an American?
So first off, when I went, it was a couple years ago, and so a lot has changed. But I had gone in November of 2016, and it was right after borders were open for Americans to go, as long as they qualified for, I think, like one of 10 specific visa types. And ours was the people to people visa. And there were ways to get there where if you were part of like a really large tour or would go to like different resort type hotels, but our specific visa was focused on culture and meeting the people. So in order to qualify it for it, you needed to stay in homestays while you were there, which was amazing. And we went for just under 2 weeks, and it was a good friend of mine and two of her friends, so the four of us. And we actually were there when Fidel Castro passed away. it was like a couple days before we were supposed to leave to come back, he passed away. So it was a really interesting experience because the whole time it kind of felt um, a little bit untouched because so few Americans had gone recently. And so it felt like the people who were visiting there were more travelers than tourists, eager to learn about the culture and understand it and meet people and form these deep connections. And it just it like the people that we met were so hospitable and curious, and you never know how you're going to be treated in a country where the political relationships between that country and the US are kind of on edge, or there's bad history. But everyone that we encountered was incredibly welcoming, and like even a couple people thanked us for coming and taking the risk so that we could see it firsthand and not just what the media says about it. And what comes to mind when I think of it, and this is for the first chunk of the trip before Castro passed away, was that Cuba felt like music and joy and laughter. Like even the street dogs seemed just super stoked on life and happy. And it just felt like there was this like vibrancy to everything. And we went to Havana, and then Cienfuegos, Trinidad, and I can't remember the name of one of the little towns that I really enjoyed. It was like my favorite bit of it. Sorry, I have a bit of mom brain right now. But we went to some kind of off the beaten track towns, and the people that we encountered most often didn't have a lot, and that was clear. And yet they seemed really, really happy, and that they valued the important stuff like family and friends. Like you'd be walking down the street and strangers would be saying hi to you or enjoy your meal, and just constantly connecting with each other. And you'd go to these plazas and everyone would be sitting down and either engaging with whoever they were with or just observing the scene. People were present without kind of like the deep effort that we strive for in our Western culture. And I think that's in part because of access to, Wi-Fi and service. It was the first time in my adult life since, the internet became a prominent part of my life that I went for 10 days straight. And that doesn't seem like a lot, but when you have your phone on you all the time, for years, and then you go without, it was really wild because the first couple days I kept pulling out my phone, kind of checking for phantom notifications or texts or anything, but I wasn't getting any of that. And then after like 2 days, it kind of got out of my system, and I started to use my phone as a tool, like an alarm clock, or as a camera, or some way to take videos, instead of something that was constantly grasping for my attention and taking me away from the present moment. So, in walking through these towns and meeting people, that was one of the biggest differences, is that people weren't all huddled up on their phones. And like now you see people hanging out, friends hanging out together, and they're sitting next to each other, but they're on their phones. And I didn't see that there. And there were a handful of larger hotels in Havana that had Wi-Fi, and you could always tell because you'd be kind of walking down cobblestone street, and you'd hear that soundtrack of Cuba, the laughter, the music, the talking, and then you'd come across these groups of people huddled up, face down, looking at their screens. And it was almost kind of like someone turned down the volume and turned down the temperature. And it was like this cold, silent spot in the middle of this lively area. And then you'd keep walking and move on. And these people were just completely unaware of whatever was going on around them. And no judgment to them. Maybe they had important stuff to check. But when I was there, it was just a constant reminder of how present they were, and perhaps as a result, how much happier they seemed. and how they valued the little that they had and the rich connections that they had with other people. And I hadn't seen that in a long time in California or in the United States.
Yeah. That's man, that is incredible because and you're right, all I knew about Cuba until it was like, oh, suddenly America is like good with Cuba at this point, or at least we're getting like all I knew was that we were very tense with one another and like, it wasn't good. And then all of a sudden it opened up and suddenly articles were coming out about like Cuba, but like they're 20 to 30 years behind, and in a lot of ways that's really beautiful, and exactly for what you're saying is like I do agree. It's like we go out to eat somewhere and we see two people sitting across from each other both on their phones, and I'm like, well, isn't this like you go out because you want to like be present and have a moment with someone special? So that's really beautiful that you got to see that somewhere else. um and I'm particularly interested when you say that you had to stay in homestays. How did you find that? And how did you find that experience with the people you were staying with?
So most of them, you could find them online. I think that the term that they used was casa particulares, and you could find them online in a similar website, kind of like how Airbnb is set up, and book it all online and everything. And the places we stayed, it usually they had kind of like a kind of separated living area with your room and a separate bathroom and stuff, and then kind of like a bed and breakfast where you would have breakfast and sometimes dinner depending on the people that you stayed with. And so you could just have conversations over meals, and they could give you recommendations and just tell them about their lives. And the one that comes to mind in particular, we were staying at, and in the morning we woke up and there was breakfast being served, and the hostess came out. She looked really upset, and again, we didn't have any internet, so we wouldn't know the news. But she came out and then started to cry and said that Fidel Castro had passed away overnight. And it was it just it was just kind of interesting. Like, we had met her like 2 days prior. She was, super friendly, and she didn't really speak any English. I speak Spanish, so we did as well as we could. And then for her to just open up and be so vulnerable and like share what had happened, it was just not a travel experience that we would typically get by staying at an Airbnb or a hotel or something. We just saw real human emotion, and you try to empathize and understand what does it all mean, and all of that. But after that happened, the country kind of went into mourning for, I think, like 10 days or something. And that meant, like, as you're walking on the streets, like no music was playing. People like were not quick to laugh, and like there weren't parties, or like it was in some of the spots like more of like parties and mojitos and vitamin R, which is like their endearing term for rum. But it was very somber, and all you could hear echoing the streets was like the news playing recaps of Castro's life and the impact on Cuba. And a fascinating thing that I learned at 17 attending a French high school is that every country's version of world history is unique and specific to the country you're learning it in. So it was a different education on the relationships of what had happened between us and them, and Castro's impact on Cuba, and that sort of thing. But the rest of the trip was, it was like 3 days before we left, and you'd come across people and they would kind of share their experience. And most people were kind of in mourning. They seemed pretty bummed, especially like more of the older generation. some of the younger generation people we met, I would say like 20% of the people were kind of like, he made my life hell, and I'm not bummed he's gone. But, we came back to the United States, and it was really interesting because right after we got off the airplane, there was a newscaster or journalist there interviewing people about their experience. And the questions were um, really trying to push us into answering one way, which is that everyone was really like glad that he was dead and celebrating. And they were asking us about like, what was it like being in the home of a Cuban when it happened? And we're like, was she just jubilated and just thrilled? And we were like, no, she cried. And we saw people lined up like around the blocks to offer their respects. And um, it was much different than what we saw on the news. So that was just kind of interesting. I went a little bit off on a tangent there, but the homestay aspect was wonderful, and just getting to know people on a little bit of a deeper level.
Wow. What a unique experience, especially seeing, you're coming right off the airplane and they're already pushing like the US narrative of what we should think about Cuba, and you're seeing firsthand like, no, we have completely different opinions, and I don't think a lot of people get to have those experiences, because you're just kind of set in your own ways of, this is what my country's showing me, I don't know any differently. So very, very unique experience that you got to have, and a very powerful one too, it seems like. And you kind of dipped into this a little bit here, but you said you speak Spanish, so I'm sure that definitely helped. And it seems like not a lot of Americans have even had the chance to go to Cuba because things are a little rocky again. So did it seem like you mostly had to rely on Spanish? It's not catered to tourism like other countries have basically force their tourism industries to speak English to cater to American tourism?
Actually, a lot of people did speak English. Knowing Spanish was helpful for like smaller restaurants. I mean, you could get by without it. Oh, in some of the smaller towns that we were in, it was helpful. We toured this tobacco farm, and fun fact is that I think the first and the last time I've had a cigar was in Cuba, and a Cuban cigar. So
Perfect.
tried the best, and then was like, I think I'm gonna retire this now. But when we when we got on the farm, like they they had an option like where the owner's son was kind of helping to explain things, and it was a little bit choppy, but then I was able to kind of ask further questions and relay his answer to the group. So you could totally get by without, but it kind of added a helpful layer and depth to all of the interactions. And I think that, again, a lot probably has changed, just in the last several years since I've gone, and more people were going. I actually just did like a Spanish intensive. They offer one in South Lake Tahoe. It's a week long, and it's outstanding. And it covers grammar, but also country specific topics for different breakaway classes. And I attended one by this guy, Marcos, who's Cuban and moved here like 20 years ago. And he was describing the situation now versus when it first kind of opened up for everyone. And it was fascinating because it's sadly like not as hopeful of a situation anymore. People are very hungry, and they don't have resources. Like, even if you have money, like it's basically the black market is providing everything, like toothpaste, toilet paper, all of your basics at a very high rate. And if you were to go try to not buy something on the black market, money wouldn't matter because nothing is stocked up anywhere. And
Mm.
he was just saying that it's pretty dire situations. And one thing that I found interesting, just the change, is he said that there's a lot of his brother is there and still living there, so they keep in contact. And he said that let's say he makes like $80 a month or something, and a carton of eggs is like $12. So it's just, you can't really afford your lifestyle unless you have family outside the country that's able to help you out or some other means.
Wow.
But that there's a sense of despair now, is what he said. And when I went in 2016, um, it was there, you could feel the hope. Things are going to change, and it was kind of sad to hear that that's changed, and he's not really sure. We're like, what could turn things around? And he's like, I don't know. Like, honestly, a lot of the young people are leaving, and so usually those would be the people that would try to enforce action, but it just keeps getting shut down. So it was really interesting to hear just how quickly that can change. And it made me realize that I think one of the things that I noticed subconsciously until I reflected on it was this sense of hope that things are going to get better. And that's something that you can certainly feel, especially on a cultural level.
Mm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm trying to wrap my head around too, like this kind of like what that feels like. Like how do you embody that? Like me in my lifetime, I've not known something like that, but to feel that hope, and then for so many of these people to see that hope kind of slowly dissipate a little bit. And I'm hopeful that somehow we can find a way to bring that hope back, because it sounds like it was a beautiful experience for you.
Mhm.
And I'm wondering if you could share a little bit more about the more of the beautiful experiences that you had too. And I know you went to a few different places, so like, how were you getting around? And then as you were getting around, what is the Cuban landscape like? What does Cuba look like, even because so many of us don't even know that?
Mhm. Um, we got around for the most part either taxis or buses, or one time we like hired a driver. It was a longer drive, and it worked well with it being just the four of us. And it it was pretty inexpensive to do public transport or even taxis or hiring that driver. And it was really cool because depending on just our luck, you either got like your average car, or you'd get one of those classic cars.
Hmm.
And they were kind of scattered throughout the city. And I think one of the things that I noticed just in looking around and in some of the cities, like let's say Havana, um, it was kind of like this beautiful juxtaposition of old and new and deteriorating versus cared for. So you'd see these old, like what you'd imagine, these buildings that were immaculate in like the 50s and stuff, now kind of crumbling and covered in vines and some like dark mold looking stuff. And then a pristine classic car that is kind of synonymous with Cuba, and it just be like scattered, old and new, deteriorating and cared for. And um, I'm trying to think. In driving, we saw some stunning nature, waterfalls, lots of beaches, pristine beaches, um, the tobacco farms. And when we were in Trinidad, it was really cool because the streets were mostly cobblestone, and the buildings ranged from very like several hundred years old to more recent. And you'd see these like 1950s cars, like a 1950s Bel Air putting down the cobblestone street, passing by a horse-drawn cart. And that particular city used to be like a big port, and there was like pirate activity. And you could totally imagine that, because like at night they just have these like kind of infrequent yellow lights lighting up the street, and you'd hear like the clatter of the horses walking. And there was this really old church that I think was from gosh, like the 1600s. I don't know, several hundred years old. And it had like it wasn't like an old church in Europe where it's you pay and you walk in and you explore. It was like it had these big metal like barred gates blocking it so you couldn't get inside, but you could kind of like peek in and see. And we looked inside because we heard like a bunch of shuffling and stuff, and looked inside the church, and it was just this group of young boys playing soccer. And again, another juxtaposition of like young and old. And it just felt like in so many places it was easy to imagine what life was like decades and hundreds of years ago. And maybe it was just the way Cuba was that made that so easy to tap into your imagination and be like, wow, can you imagine and like get into that place of wonder and awe? But maybe it was also because we we weren't on our phones. And so we got to tap into presence and being aware of what was around us and really noticing it instead of just a fleeting glance.
Hmm.
Wow, that's so special. It seems like when I think of Cuba, I think of like the old cars and the smoking of cigars and just kind of frozen in time almost. But I like how, you touched upon like there are the young kids playing there. There is new life and newer buildings there as well. So, well, it may be 20 to 30 years behind everywhere else. It still has that charm, but also bringing in the new as well. And I wonder, as you're having these experiences, were they just kind of happening on their own? Were you able to do a lot of research ahead of time? Or was it just kind of winging it as you got there?
Um, a lot of winging it. You know, we had an itinerary of where we were going and staying. That was certain. And the rest, it was kind of hard to plan in advance. We were able to get an idea of, some of the sights to see in each of the places that we were staying. But in regards to the logistics of getting there and actually how much something would cost and um, do people tip, or how do you
Hmm.
flag down a taxi? Because that's different in like every country too. You think it's easy, but like different hand motions and stuff.
Yep.
How do you get on the bus and pay? And so a lot of it was just kind of figure it out as you go, have a rough idea. And I like that style trip a lot. I've done it different ways where, I have my set things, try to get as much done as possible and see all the sites, because most of us are limited on our time, and does depending on where you're going, it takes a while to get someplace. So you want to take advantage of it. I get that. But that was a trip where it kind of forced slow travel on you a little bit,
Hmm.
and don't overplan, just have an idea. And I felt like just being there was like the travel experience, not like, hey, let's go to France and we have to see the Eiffel Tower. And that means we went to France, instead of just let's go there and let's eat baguettes.
Oh, yes, the food. Oh, that's the perfect transition. Um, so I currently live in Tampa, Florida, and there is a huge Cuban population here. So I've been fully immersed in the Cuban food, or at least the version that is here now. So when I think of Cuban food, I'm like, oh, I'm craving a Cuban. There's lots of guava, things like that. But I'm curious, what is food in Cuba? Like, what does that look like?
So I did hear, like, when I did that Spanish immersion thing just a couple weeks ago. Um, Now there's a lot less resources for providing, just really tasty food. And when I went, there was kind of a boom in like, hey, restaurant scene, like let's attract
Mm,
people because they love to eat and everything. But I think that was kind of a unique blip in what's available and what was available before and after, because it all depends on the cost of goods and how easily you can access it. When I was there was a lot of rice and beans and pork, eggs, plantains, like lots of tropical fruit, guava, juices made with that. It was all very good, but it also simple. Um, Seafood too, depending on where you were. But yeah, it was like simple but very good and hearty.
Mm, can't go wrong with that. Quite
Yeah,
honestly, I all that sounds good to me. I'd eat it.
yeah.
Oh, that's
How
fantastic.
about any desserts? That's my part of the food segment always. Were there any like desserts like, you think Italy, you think gelato. Do they have any like signature desserts or anything that stood out to you?
Oh man, I that's one of the things I seek out. And right now, the thing that's coming to mind is just like the tropical fruit, which like normally I'm more like classic dessert, like you want to eat fruit instead, but it was very good. Um, and there was a handful of like gelato places there actually. And ice cream is amazing, but honestly, like one I don't know, it didn't really feel like there was a huge emphasis on desserts besides like popsicles and ice creams, and maybe I just missed that, I don't know. But it seemed like people's after dinner treat was more like a sugary minty mojito, and those,
Mm.
those were good too.
Ugh, that sounds amazing. Like I'm in. I really am hopeful that I know that it sounds like the people of Cuba or of Cuban descent even are not incredibly hopeful. I'm really hopeful that we can somehow, even if, I don't know what it looks like, but I'm hopeful that this what sounds like a beautiful country and beautiful like population of people, because we often forget when we talk about a country that we're not just talking about the politicians and the news anchors and the things that we're hearing.
Mhm.
It's people that feel emotion. It's people that need the same things we do, that have the same maybe not the same ideals, but that deserve the same respect. And so I'm very hopeful, and I hurt on behalf of the Cuban population right now, and I'm hopeful that we can find a way to get back to the beauty and the laughter and
Mhm.
everything like that, so that we can all just kind of enjoy the different cultures and everything. And I'm wondering if you have any favorite memories that maybe we can manifest some infused beauty into all of this.
Honestly, like I don't know if there was any one specific one. It was just the their vibe, like everyone felt so like eager to interact with each other, and like I don't know, I've always been kind of shy and not I'm more introverted, and so sometimes you meet someone who's like so outgoing but genuine and like joyful that you just can't help but interact with them and kind of like laugh along. And it was like so many people that we met there, they just like come up to you because they were curious. And, if that was me at home, I'd be like, can you space, please? Like, but they were just so genuinely curious and interested about our experience. And we were like, well, tell us about yours. And it just seemed like the people that we interacted with were so welcoming and hospitable and resilient. Like after going through and still continuing to go through decades of really tough stuff, families being separated and not having enough and just struggling. And I think they they shared that you had to find the good where you could, pretty much, and go with the flow and kind of let go of expectations and appreciate, like swap expectations for appreciation. And just they were very curious and kind and open-hearted. And so it was really refreshing. And so I know it's not really a specific memory, but it was repeated like with so many different people in every place that we went. And that was really unique to Cuba out of all the other places that I've been.
Yeah, I think that's really beautiful. I think it kind of just like puts a nice little bow on Cuba. And, as Americans, we only see the American side of the media and whatever the media wants us to think of Cuba. So the fact that you got to see Cuba in its own form and were able to speak for themselves, I think you're a really great advocate for, Cuba and how amazing that country really is. Um, I don't have any more questions. Regan, do you before we get into the travel blitz?
No, this was an amazing conversation. So, Kat, thank you. And then we'll head right into our travel blitz. Allie, you want to kick us off?
Yes. So the travel blitz, just whatever comes to mind, does not have to be Cuba specific by any means.
Okay.
So what is your number one travel tip or hack?
You know what? I don't know if it's just because I just said it, but I do try to live this way. Is to swap expectations for appreciation. So that's kind of a esoteric one. I don't know if you wanted more like tangible, but going to a new place and instead of, you know, it's natural for us to look at something and be like, well, this is different, and just kind of leave it at that. Don't be like, this is wrong and I do it right. And I think that most people who travel get that. They go, hey, these people are all living and thriving and they do it differently. So you kind of listen and look to learn instead of agree or disagree. And that kind of pairs with the swapping expectations for appreciation for, what you're seeing and experiencing.
Mm. Yes. Yes, that fits the bill. I think that is perfect. And it's something that we have talked about on our podcast time and time again is like we are going into their country and we're not bringing our country with us.
Mhm.
So just enjoy where you're at and who you're with.
Mhm.
Um, all right, question number 2. Your top 3 favorite destinations that you've been to.
Oh, this is a hard question. Can I choose a
It really
continent?
is. If you'd like, go for it.
Okay, I am. So I would say South America is a continent. Every country is unique, but I find myself going back again and again, and I just love it there. Like, oh gosh, I almost want to extend it to Latin America. Could I just say a region of the world? I don't
Sure.
know. But I would say like I love that area, especially Ecuador and Argentina, where I lived for a little bit. And then this counts as my one. And then number 2, New Zealand, amazing. Probably I went on my honeymoon and did a road trip and covered both islands, and it's the most consistently beautiful place I've ever seen. Stunning nature. And number 3, I would say it's tied between Nepal and Myanmar, both because beautiful and still felt kind of like raw and amazing people. It felt like a true adventure in both those spots.
Awesome. That's great. Some of those we haven't even heard yet, so I like it. Another hard one though. Top 3 destinations you want to go to.
Ooh, okay. I have one easy one because we're going in a week. Norway. So it'll be first first international trip with the full family. So family of 4. So that'll be interesting. Um, and then, yikes. I would say um, I would love to go to several spots in Africa. I've been to Morocco, which is Northern Africa, so much different, more like Arabic influence. And I'd love to go to Tanzania or Kenya or Namibia or one of those spots and see the nature and the people and the food there.
Hmm.
So I listed a bunch of countries. I want to go to a lot of places.
Me do too.
For our listeners who cannot see the recording, Kat has a giant world map behind her, and I think she just should have submitted that as her answer for where she wants to go to. Even though
Yeah.
she's been to a lot of places, but we feel the same way. It's too hard to narrow it down. Question number 4 here. What's the strangest thing you've eaten while traveling?
Oh, I'm going to say two things. Cuy, which in Ecuador is guinea pig and one of their specialties. It was described to me before. So first off, like, you go to a place and you hear like the unique traditional thing to try. And I wasn't really thrilled to hear it was the same thing that like was in my preschool. But and the same animal that like you are only allowed to buy in pairs because they get really lonely by themselves. And it was described by a local that it was oily and crunchy. And I was like, something described as oily and crunchy sounds kind of
Tantalizing.
interesting. I tried it. I don't think I'll have it again, so I can just check it off the list. The other thing was Boudin Noir, which is like a French specialty. And when I was studying abroad there, they kind of tell you before you go, be open to everything, trying new things, the way people do stuff. So I was like, I'm on board. I'm going to be open with everything. And that was one thing that I tried that I felt so embarrassed, but I couldn't finish it. I was just like, I just can't like, and it's blood sausage. And so it was like congealed cooked blood in a sausage
Oh,
skin. And the way that they did it was like the host family invited over their friends and like watched me eat it. And I was just like, oh, the
that's
pressure. And I was just like,
mortifying.
I
Oh my
Oh
can't.
my gosh.
gosh. Good for you for trying it. I don't even know that I'd get that far. Yikes. Oof.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oof.
All right, and
Oof.
then last but not least, top thing you can't travel without, minus, the essentials.
Mhm. This one's easy for me. Journal. From that first trip at 17. It was so lucky. My best friend gave me a journal, and it was like a week before I left. I didn't even think of packing one. And ever since then, every trip I go on, I bring a journal and I write every day that I'm traveling. And I've referenced them multiple times. Used it helped, when writing my book, and it also helped me gain confidence as a writer. And then one challenge is like when I go places longer term, I try to learn the language and write what I can. And so let's use France as an example. I started out like majority English and then would plug in French words where I could. And then by the end of the 6 months, it was mostly French with a scattering of English. The problem is I came back, went to college, and the college didn't offer French, so I switched to Spanish. And it's true that if you don't use it, you lose it. And now I can't read my journal. I don't know what it says. It's a motivation to relearn it, I guess, to understand what teenage Cat was thinking.
Oh my
Uh,
gosh, that's gonna be an amazing project for you someday of like, or even if it's that your kids like find this journal someday and like they then have to decode it and it becomes like a national treasure kind of thing. Like, oh man, that's amazing though. I have to ask, what is your journaling style?
When I'm traveling, I usually write end of day or the next morning and just share specifics of like what I did. And I sometimes even try to get down to like the granular stuff, which I want to do more of because it's always been interesting to look back on. Like, I got this for lunch. This is what was included, and it cost this much.
Mm.
Like in Ecuador, they had a menu, like a set almuerzo, a set lunch, and lunch there is the main meal of the day, just like in the US, dinner is. And you could get this was in 2012. So I don't know how much it's changed. But in 2012, you could get the set menu for $2 and it would be a fresh squeezed, like delicious tropical juice, a soup, a main that had like a protein and rice, beans, plantains, and a dessert for like $2. And I think if I didn't write that down, I wouldn't have believed myself thinking about it later. Like I must be exaggerating. But so like general stuff like that, what I did, what I saw, interactions that I had, especially one thing I love writing about is just acts of kindness. I don't want to forget those. Those are what makes the trip of people just, I feel like when you travel, you're more open to these interactions. And maybe, I don't know if like it's me putting something out or me just being more open to it than I would in daily life. But I feel like I have so many where I travel and people are like eager to help or offer insight or just kind of connect. And it's like just like little kindnesses without any expectation of anything in return because you're in another country. And one example that pops up is a couple years ago, let's see, 2 years ago, we went to Chile with my husband and my son, who was just under 2 years old at the time. So we were trying to stretch the limits of, not paying for a airplane seat for him. He was 23 months. It was pretty darn close.
You're brave.
And he was too big. He's too big. And I've learned my lesson. For this next trip to Norway, I bought the 1-year-old a seat because he's so wiggly. It's like an alligator in your arms at all times. So I've learned. But with River, the older one, we were in Chile. We were in a row of 3 on the way there, and this woman who was sitting in the aisle, and also I was pregnant at the time, so I was like, oh no, I'm stuck in the window and I'm going to get pee anxiety because I won't be able to sneak out past her without hitting her with my belly button or something. And we were just, entertaining him. And he was being super quiet and keeping to himself. And she was like, we were just having conversation with her, and she was in her 60s going there to do a 2-month long hike with her friend. And, she's married, has kids, but she's doing this trip with just her girlfriend who was sitting in a different aisle seat. And she's like, you know what? You guys have my seat. I'll go sit next to her because there's a middle seat open. So she opted for an 11-hour flight in the middle seat so that we could have a full row for our kid. And it's like, that set the stage for the trip. Yeah, I don't know her name, but she made such an impact just with that kindness, and so that's what I really like to write about because it brings me back to the moment very easily.
Yeah, wow.
Amazing.
That is wonderful. This conversation has been phenomenal. And for our listeners who want more awesomeness from Kat, please, please, please check out her book, The Joys of Jet Lag. It's jam-packed full of more golden nuggets and wisdom and thought-provoking ideas. So be sure to check out Kat on social media as well and get a copy of her book. You will not regret it. Thank you so much, Kat. We've loved having you on here, and we hope our listeners did as well.
Thank you. I had a great time.
Thanks for tuning in to the Wanderlusting Wives podcast. Come escape with us again every other Tuesday for Travel Tuesdays.
Don't forget to give us a subscribe and a follow on all of our social media and wherever you listen to your podcasts. And until next time, wander on.